The sun was already high above the Montana hills when Sam Jarrett threw the last bale of hay into the truck bed. His shirt clung to his back, soaked through with sweat, and his palms were rougher than most folks' leather gloves. A few feet away, his brother Luke was checking the fence line, silently running his hand along the freshly stretched barbed wire. They didn't speak much when they worked. There was a rhythm to ranch life that didn't require chatter, but their coordination was second nature, like two parts of the same weathered machine. The Jarrett brothers had grown up on this land, inherited it from their grandfather after years of waiting for lawyers to sort through a web of outdated wills and overlapping deeds. The property spanned nearly 200 acres of dry plains, crooked trees, and broken rock. It wasn't picturesque in the way magazines sold the West to tourists. It was real, hard, earned, unforgiving, and magnificent in its resistance to change. They weren't rich men. Sam, the older of the two, had once left the county for work in Idaho, but he came back a few years later when the city's promises turned out to be just more mouths talking over each other. Luke never left. He spent the last 2 decades running the ranch, keeping it afloat through bad feed years and stubborn livestock markets, watching the rest of the county slowly evolve into something neither of them fully recognized. Subdivisions had started popping up in places where deer used to bed down. Asphalt roads cut through the fields they'd ridden horses across as teenagers. There were new faces at the feed store, soft-spoken men in polos and women who drove imported SUVs with vanity plates that said things like WLDSPRT and MOM CEO. The pressure had been building for years. Local developers pushed to turn the area into a transitional community, trying to brand the surrounding ranchlands as part of a larger suburban project with rural luxury amenities. That was code for HOA-controlled neighborhoods, homes with 3-car garages and matching mailboxes, and bylaws about which kind of grass you could grow in your yard. Sam and Luke were never part of any such development. Their land sat just outside the boundary lines of that expansion, locked under county jurisdiction, untouchable, or so they thought. And yet, over the past 6 months they'd started getting strange mail. Letters with no return address, no county seal, just slick formatting and vague warnings about zoning concerns, unauthorized agricultural structures, and safety code observations. None of it made any legal sense. The letters weren't signed by any official office, and the envelope headers used acronyms neither of the brothers recognized. At first, they laughed it off. Sam tacked the first one to the inside of the feed shed and drew a crude mustache on the printed name of the community liaison, who authored it. Luke tossed the second one in the fire barrel without even opening it, but the third letter arrived by courier. A man in a khaki vest and mirrored sunglasses walked up their gravel drive, didn't say a word, just handed over a sealed folder and turned right back around. Sam opened it at the kitchen table, and the silence that followed said more than any words could. The language was firm, almost legalistic, full of references to articles and sections of a code they'd never agreed to abide by. It accused them of maintaining unapproved structures, inappropriate livestock proximity to future residential corridors, and unregulated use of land for non-compliant purposes. Luke looked up from the page, his jaw tight. "This ain't the county." Sam shook his head. "No, it's the new neighbors. They're trying to push us in." A few days later, it got worse. A patrol cart, an actual low-speed electric vehicle with a mounted flashing light and the words Community Oversight Unit stenciled on the side, began driving past the front gate twice a day. No one announced its arrival. No one explained what it was doing there. It didn't belong to the sheriff's office, nor to any legitimate agency they could trace. The first time it passed, Luke stood at the fence with a thermos of coffee in one hand and a rusted pair of fencing pliers in the other, watching as the vehicle crawled by, the driver inside staring ahead like they had every right to be there. Sam came out onto the porch and said nothing. They both just watched. The cart disappeared around the bend and didn't return until sundown. Then the signage started. First, a laminated notice zip-tied to their cattle gate, listing vague ordinance violations with QR codes at the bottom. The QR codes led nowhere. Then a post was installed on the road shoulder, not quite on their property, but close enough to matter. It was glossy, like something printed for a realtor's open house. Upcoming Integration Zone, it said in bold lettering. Underneath, all properties subject to inspection and compliance by community planning standards. No contact number, no signature, just the implication that something larger was already in motion. Sam didn't believe in going to war with paper. He believed in boundary lines, fences, and shaking a man's hand before you challenged his claim. But these people didn't play that game. They operated through silence, through slow pressure, through creeping jurisdiction where there hadn't been any. They never knocked on the door. They never introduced themselves. They simply assumed that if they showed up enough times, wrote enough fake paperwork, and planted enough signs, Sam and Luke would get tired and fold. But the Jarrett brothers were cut from another cloth. Their grandfather once stood in front of a bank auction with a shotgun to keep a developer from claiming the farm next door after the widow died. He'd ended up in jail for 2 days, and when he came out, the auction was over and the land was still in the hands of the family. That's the kind of blood they came from. Not violent, just immovable, stubborn as limestone. So when the cart showed up again the following Thursday, rolling just past their gate at dusk with its little orange light blinking like a joke, Sam stepped down from the porch, pulled on his gloves, and turned to Luke. "Time we show 'em what county means," he said. They didn't speak again for a while. They waited until the vehicle stopped near the property line, the driver fiddling with some clipboard, acting like they had the right to be there. Luke walked up from the back pasture, whistling to the dogs to stay out of the way. Sam climbed up into the hay truck, fired the engine, and rolled slowly forward. Not too close, not reckless, just enough to let the message sink in. Then they did what needed doing. Quietly, efficiently. And when it was done, they left a note on the steering wheel in big black marker. "We're county, not clowns." They didn't yell. They didn't make threats. But they knew from that moment on the lines had been drawn, not on a map, but in the dirt. And the next move wouldn't come with a clipboard. The cart didn't come back the next day, or the day after. For a while, it looked like the message had landed and the unspoken standoff was over. But Sam and Luke both knew better. Ranchers have a sixth sense about threats, about whether something is finished or just regrouping. The silence that followed felt too clean, too coordinated, like someone paused the music but hadn't left the room. So when a pair of beige trucks with tinted windows rolled past the cattle chute on a Tuesday morning, neither brother was surprised. The vehicles didn't stop, didn't even slow down. They just passed through, turned around near the ridge, and came back the same way. No plates, no markings, no nods or waves. Sam watched from the back porch, holding his coffee with both hands like it was anchoring him. Luke, kneeling near the water trough with a pipe wrench, glanced up just long enough to track the movement. "They're scouting the access lines," he said without looking away from the rusted bolt. "They're not done." The next hit was subtle, but it hit where it hurt. 3 days later, the ranch's standing order of feed supplement, delivered bi-weekly without issue for the past 4 years, was delayed. When Sam called the supplier, he was put on hold, then transferred to a new manager who insisted they'd temporarily suspended distribution to non-compliant rural accounts in the area due to pending zoning clarification. Sam didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He let the man finish his well-rehearsed excuse, then simply said, "This account's been active since 1986. You're going to get me the number for your legal department, or I'm going to treat this like a breach of contract." There was silence on the line for a moment. Then a click. Then another voice, older, more cautious, came on and promised they'd get the order back on track. It arrived 2 days later, but the damage was done. The message was clear. Someone was leaning on vendors. and whoever it was had reach. A week after that, Luke got a call from one of their longtime renters, a local youth camp that used a remote corner of the property every summer for wilderness training. The man on the phone was polite but anxious, tripping over his words as he explained that his board had received an anonymous packet in the mail outlining environmental safety concerns about the land. "There's talk of legal exposure," he muttered, not sounding convinced himself. "They don't want trouble. You know how it is." Luke didn't argue. He thanked him for the honesty and hung up. "They're hitting income streams now," he told Sam, who nodded without speaking. That night, they sat on the porch longer than usual, sipping beer and watching the tree line. "They're trying to starve us out," Sam finally said. "Not through courts, through strangulation." It wasn't just supplies and contracts, even the utilities started getting strange. The county water inspector left a red tag notice on the main gate, claiming that the ranch's auxiliary well was operating without proper clearance. It was nonsense. Sam had the permit from 15 years ago laminated and tacked inside the tool shed, but the tag had the same clean formatting and vague bureaucratic threat as the letters they'd been receiving. Luke drove down to the municipal office to clear it up, and the clerk behind the counter squinted at the code listed on the notice. "This isn't one of ours," she said, puzzled. "That's not even a valid citation string. I don't know where this came from." Luke took a photo of her expression, not because he needed evidence, but because something about it, the honest confusion, felt like the first real moment of clarity in weeks. These notices weren't county. They weren't state. They were invented, and someone had enough confidence to push them like they were law. The final straw came early one morning when Sam walked out to feed the stock and found that the eastern cattle gate had been opened. Not broken, not damaged, just left unlatched. 20 head of Angus had wandered half a mile off the range overnight, and it took hours to round them back. Sam knew every man and woman in the area who'd ever worked livestock, and no one with even half a brain would leave a gate loose unless they wanted chaos. It wasn't kids. It wasn't carelessness. It was a message, one that only ranchers would fully understand. He didn't mention it to Luke until later that evening, when the dust had settled and the cattle were calm again. "They're not just pressing from the outside," he said, lighting a cigarette he'd sworn off last year. "They're testing for cracks, seeing how long we hold." Luke didn't say anything, just nodded once, slow and deliberate. The tension stretched out like a taut wire. Friends stopped calling. Old neighbors started acting like they didn't see the brothers when they crossed paths in town. Sam overheard a whispered comment at the gas station, something about troublemakers up on Jarrett land. Even the postmaster, a woman they'd known since they were boys, started leaving their mail in a side bin instead of the regular lockbox. That mail now included more envelopes with fake seals, more warnings dressed up as notices, and one large manila packet with a printed aerial map of their property, color-coded with zones labeled Phase 2 Expansion Area. There was no sender listed, no cover letter, just a high-resolution drone photo of their ranch, sliced up like someone was already preparing to move in. That night, Luke stood at the edge of the southern fence line with a flashlight and a shotgun. He didn't expect to find anyone. He just wanted to be seen. It became clear that whoever they were up against wasn't going to stop with intimidation. They were setting the stage for something bigger. Maybe a forced annexation through a developer-bought vote. Maybe a legal trap. Maybe just pressure until the Jarretts cracked and sold off at a discount. But it didn't matter, because by then the brothers weren't thinking about deals. They were thinking about lines, those drawn in dirt and in blood. That's when they called Norton. Charles Norton was a land use attorney from the next county over. He didn't advertise. He didn't keep a website. His business cards were plain white, and his voicemail message was just a gravel-voiced, "Leave it." But people like the Jarretts knew to call him when the paperwork got slippery and someone needed to stand between a man and a bulldozer. Norton came out 2 days later, driving an old Toyota that still had dust from 5 counties ago on its bumper. He stepped out, nodded once, and said, "I'll need coffee and the last 10 years of title docs. Let's start there." What followed wasn't a dramatic speech or a hero's rallying cry. It was quiet calculation. Norton asked questions that made the brothers realize how deep this went, how the attackers had left just enough room in their fake documents to cause real problems, and how the strategy wasn't just bullying, but legal mimicry designed to create paralysis. But Norton also laid out the countermeasure. Paper. Real paper. Verified records. County seals. Recorded easements. A slow, methodical counteroffensive through legitimate bureaucracy. The kind that burned hot only after months of silent fuel buildup. And so it began. The brothers weren't going to fight this with fists. They were going to build a wall out of facts and nail it shut with county stamps. But that didn't mean they were done sending messages either. Because the next time that cart rolled by, and Norton warned it would, they wouldn't just leave a note. They'd leave a story. One the opposition would think about every time they looked west. It started with the silence of paperwork, and that was always the worst kind. The kind that meant something was already moving, already being decided, and you wouldn't know until it was too late. Sam and Luke had handed over everything Norton asked for. Old deeds, copies of the land survey, grandfather's original zoning exemption from 1963. Even the back page scribbled notes left by the previous attorney in the margins of the mineral rights. Clause. Norton worked out of their dining room for a week. The table covered in yellow folders and legal pads, every inch stacked with dates, references, and circled ordinance codes. The brothers gave him space, mostly. They weren't used to having someone else in their house, least of all a man who barely spoke unless he had something loaded behind the words. When Norton finally looked up and said, "They're laying the foundation for a hostile administrative claim," Sam just muttered, "Knew it," and poured another cup of coffee. Luke didn't say anything. He was too busy staring out the window at the same dirt road where the patrol cart had rolled by last week. They knew it would come back. The only question was when. When it did, it wasn't alone. They heard it before they saw it. An engine that didn't belong to any county vehicle they'd ever encountered. Not the rumble of a diesel, not the whine of a truck pulling a trailer. This was a mechanical hum, steady and slow, like something deliberately moving through terrain it didn't understand. Sam stepped out onto the porch with a rag in his hand, wiping grease off his knuckles from the generator he'd been adjusting. Luke joined him with a crowbar still hooked in his belt. Down the road came the same patrol cart, but this time it was followed by a flatbed utility vehicle painted in neutral gray, unmarked, but too clean to belong to any of the locals. On its back was a small tower rig, thin with a disc-shaped top like a weather sensor. The brothers exchanged a look. Sam spoke first, his voice low but steady. "That's a terrain scanner." Luke just nodded. "They're mapping the grade," he said. "For what?" "For what comes next." The cart stopped 20 feet from the front gate, and the flatbed rolled in behind it. Two men stepped out. One was the same driver they'd seen before, nondescript, clean-shaven, sunglasses too large for his face. The other was heavier, maybe in his 40s, wearing a collared shirt tucked into tactical-style pants. He held a clipboard, but not the cheap kind, the kind made from carbon fiber with metal latches, like he expected someone to challenge his authority. He didn't come to the fence, didn't wave, just started writing something while the driver moved to the back of the scanner rig and began powering it on. The tower lit up with a soft hum, and its disk rotated once, slowly, like a satellite searching for a signal. Luke took 2 steps forward, boots crunching dry gravel. "You got a permit for that?" he called out. The man with the clipboard didn't even look up. "We're conducting environmental baselining," he replied, his voice flat and precise. "Standard practice for land conversion evaluation." Sam tilted his head. "This isn't conversion land. This is legacy jurisdiction. County only. You're trespassing." Finally, the man looked up. Your boundary documentation is being reviewed. Until it's resolved, this property is under provisional evaluation." He said it like it was already decided. The tower rotated again. Luke dropped the crowbar from his belt and walked forward until he was within 10 feet of the scanner. "Turn it off," he said calmly. "You can either shut it down yourself, or I can do it for you." The driver hesitated. The man with the clipboard stayed still, but there was a flicker of calculation behind his eyes now. Sam stepped off the porch, walking slowly but deliberately toward the gate. Norton appeared behind them, having stepped out without a sound. He said nothing, just stood there with a file folder in one hand, observing. The silence stretched. The scanner continued to rotate. Then the clipboard man nodded to his driver. "Shut it down," he said. The rig powered off with a soft click. Without a word, both men climbed back into their vehicles. The patrol cart led the way out. The flatbed followed. No confrontation, no apology. But they left behind deep tracks in the dirt. And something worse, a pressure in the air that hadn't been there before. That night, Norton said what everyone already knew. "They were testing you," he said. "Seeing how close they could get. Seeing what you'd tolerate." Sam didn't answer. Luke just muttered, "They'll be back." The next blow came sideways. They didn't hear it. They smelled it. One morning, the cattle were uneasy, pacing near the north tree line, snorting, eyes wide. Sam and Luke moved in to check, and they found it just beyond the brush line. Several plastic buckets, dumped half hidden in the grass, still reeking of chemical feed additive. Old, expired, improperly stored. Whoever left it had scattered it near the water trough path, where the stock might have grazed through out of habit. They caught it in time. Nothing had been ingested. But the implications were serious. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was tampering, poisoning, if they'd been a day slower. They filed a report with the county livestock board. The investigator came out, took samples, logged the incident, but didn't offer much hope. "You got no cameras, no witnesses, and no way to prove intent," he said. "But someone wants you hurt, that's clear." Luke looked at the buckets again. "Not someone," he said. "An operation." 3 days later, a drone buzzed overhead. It wasn't flying high like a hobbyist's toy. It flew low, fast, sweeping the tree line and doubling back in wide arcs like it was scanning for something. Sam grabbed the old 12-gauge from the kitchen and stepped onto the roof of the hay shed. He tracked the drone with the barrel but didn't fire. Not yet. He waited. Watched. The drone circled once more and then zipped off toward the ridge where the new developments were expanding. That night, they installed cameras. Not the cheap kind. Real surveillance equipment. Luke had a friend from their supplier days send a set down from Montana under a business invoice labeled Livestock Thermal Monitoring. They mounted the units on the main gate, the tree line, and the supply shed. It wasn't paranoia. It was due diligence. Because what was coming wasn't random. A letter arrived the following Monday, a different tone, not a threat, a suggestion, an offer. The envelope was thick, printed on smooth stock. Inside, a single-page letter from something called Western Horizon Community Development Group, addressed to landholder Jarrett. It expressed interest in discussing voluntary annexation procedures in exchange for generous relocation incentives. Attached was a brochure, high-gloss blue skies, a mock-up of a proposed community plaza where their cattle yard currently stood. Luke laughed out loud. Sam just stared at the rendering. It showed children playing where their grandfather used to hang deer for dressing. "They think this is persuasion," he muttered. "This is war." They brought it to Norton. He read it once, then again, slower. "They're formalizing the pressure," he said, "trying to dress it up as compromise. That means they're gearing up to escalate." And escalate it did. Within the week, someone filed a noise complaint with the county about early morning livestock disturbance. A crew arrived on the adjacent property, running measurements for what they claimed was utility grid modernization. Luke checked the survey stakes they left behind and found them 6 feet over the official property line. The straw was dry now, 1 spark away. So the brothers made a decision. They wouldn't chase ghosts anymore. They wouldn't keep playing defense. They'd start documenting everything, pushing back with precision, and when the next cart showed up, because it would, they wouldn't just roll it into a ditch with a note. They'd make sure the entire move was framed, recorded, and submitted through official county channels. "You want to play their game?" Norton asked. "Then learn to make paper cut like barbed wire." Sam looked out across the hills, jaw clenched. "No," he said, "we make it bleed." The tipping point didn't come with another card or anonymous notice. It came in the form of an unexpected voice. Late one morning, Sam was hauling fencing material to the western edge of the property when his phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. Normally, he wouldn't answer, but something in the area code caught his eye. Local, but not from the town. He picked up. The voice on the other end was cautious, clipped, almost rehearsed. It belonged to a junior clerk from the county recorder's office who identified herself as Elise. She explained carefully that she was calling off record and that she wasn't supposed to be doing this, but that her conscience didn't sit right. "There's a request in motion," she said, "to reclassify your land as a pending use parcel. It was submitted 3 weeks ago. It bypassed standard checks. No signatures from your side. No notification. It was quietly moved to a review queue for integration." Sam didn't say much. He asked for the tracking number, thanked her, and hung up. By the time he reached the house, he'd already dialed Norton. Norton didn't respond with shock. He just cursed under his breath and said, "They're playing county-level chess now." Over the next 48 hours, he combed through the registrar databases, calling in favors, piecing together a chain of document movements that looked legitimate, on the surface but unraveled under scrutiny. It turned out that someone with access had filed a coordination suggestion through a third-party development liaison, a legal fiction created to propose zoning shifts without triggering mandatory notifications. It was dirty, it was clever, and it had a paper trail, however thin. Sam and Luke weren't just being pushed, they were being boxed in, slowly and quietly, through backdoor paperwork dressed up as procedural reform. Norton made a move. He filed a public injunction request with the County Oversight Committee to freeze any reclassification efforts tied to their parcel ID. The request didn't guarantee protection, but it slowed things down. It added friction. It made the other side play their next card more carefully. And they did. 2 days later, a black SUV pulled up near the property entrance, not crossing the boundary but parking close enough to make a point. Out stepped a woman in an all-white linen suit, boots too clean for real soil, hair pulled back like every strand was under contract. She didn't carry a clipboard. She carried a leather folder and a tone that didn't ask for introductions. "Megan Bell," she said, extending a hand that neither brother took. "Regional negotiator for land relations on behalf of Western Horizon. I'd like a moment of your time." Sam crossed his arms. Luke stood still. Megan continued. "I'm here to offer a structured agreement, a cooperative transition. We recognize that this parcel holds emotional value, but we also believe there's opportunity for everyone if the right conversations are had." Her voice was polished, but she wasn't selling. She was stating terms. She opened the folder and revealed a detailed rendering of what their land could look like. A retail plaza where their loading area stood, townhomes layered into their hillsides, a heritage loop trail that supposedly preserved the character of the area. Luke glanced down, then back at her. "You think drawing playgrounds where our livestock sleep makes this easier?" Megan didn't blink. "I think recognition of inevitability allows for better control of outcome. You can participate in the design, or resist it, and be overrun by it. We've done this before. This isn't personal. Sam stepped forward, taking the folder gently and closing it. "You've done this before," he repeated. "But not here." He handed it back. "We're county. We don't answer to your playbook." Megan's smile was thin, professional, but her eyes tightened. "You will eventually," she said. "Better it be on your terms." Then she turned and walked away, her boots clicking unnaturally on the gravel. That evening, they sat with Norton and laid everything out. Megan wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a developer. She was a pressure tool. A high-level fixer meant to look like a negotiator, while legal machinery churned quietly in the background. Norton had seen it before in another county. It started with polite offers, then roadblocks to services, then sudden county hearings conveniently scheduled with little notice. And then, one morning, someone woke up to find survey flags on their front lawn. "They've identified this land as soft," Norton said. "They don't understand you yet, but they will." Sam asked the only question that mattered. "What do we hit next?" Norton leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "You file a motion for declaratory protection of use, establish prior and current land utilization for the last 20 years. That gives you standing. We also document every single incident with timestamps and start submitting counterclaims through civil code, not zoning. It'll flood their machine with enough noise that they either back off or get tangled trying to fight in two arenas at once." Luke looked up. "And if they don't back off?" Norton's voice was cold. "Then we bleed them by procedure, paper for paper, hour for hour." The following day, a small drone was spotted hovering just above the western field. No identifying marks, no FAA ID, flying just low enough to evade easy tracking. This time, Sam didn't wait. He fired a warning shot into the dirt 50 feet from its path and it zipped away without resistance. They didn't bother calling the sheriff. By now, they knew where the lines were. Instead, they drafted an incident report and mailed it with proof of land boundaries and a copy of FAA regulations on commercial drone operation above private property. It wasn't about the drone. It was about the message behind it. This land is not empty. These people are not afraid. You cannot sneak your way through them. That night, as the sun disappeared behind the hills and the wind kicked up dust from the dry creek beds, the brothers sat by the fire outside the barn. The cattle were quiet. The air was still. Sam sipped from a tin cup and looked into the flames. "They're pushing harder now," he said, "faster than before." Luke nodded. "Because they know we've drawn a line." Sam didn't respond right away. Then slowly he said, "Good. Now we'll see who crosses it first." 3 days after Megan Bell's visit, a crew arrived unannounced on the eastern border of the Jarrett property. They came in 2 white pickups and a van marked Community Infrastructure Unit, a name no one in the county had heard of before, but one that sounded just official enough to confuse anyone who hadn't spent the last month knee-deep in forged notices and phantom ordinances. The crew didn't knock. They didn't call out. They began marking the dirt shoulder near the cattle fence with orange spray paint, laying out what looked like trenching guides along the dry patch of land that separated the Jarrett's grazing field from the gravel county road. Luke noticed them first while checking irrigation flow and approached slowly, not aggressive, but not soft either. One of the workers, clipboard in hand, muttered something about utility upgrades tied to regional planning compliance, as if reading from a line he'd been told to memorize and repeat. Luke stood there without blinking and asked a simple question. "Do you have a permit number and county case file for this work?" The man hesitated, then shifted to something about pending authorization in process. That was all Luke needed to hear. He turned and walked straight to the barn, where Sam and Norton were reviewing the latest round of procedural filings. 15 minutes later, all 3 men stood at the edge of the property line, holding hard copies of county jurisdiction maps, printouts of title history, and a registered notice of private land designation. Norton spoke first. Not loud, not dramatic, but with the kind of precision that didn't allow interpretation. You are currently operating on a boundary-adjacent strip under exclusive county designation, not committee oversight, not utility cooperative expansion, and you have no signed entry documentation from the landowner. The man with the clipboard opened his mouth but stopped when he saw Norton hold up a phone already recording. "If you proceed without immediate withdrawal," he continued, "we will file for unlawful encroachment and trespass, submit visual documentation to the county office, and serve an emergency cease and desist through the district clerk. And we will win." The workers, realizing they had walked into a hornet's nest, didn't argue. They packed up within 10 minutes. But they left behind a different kind of trace. Survey markers buried 6 inches into the dirt, small steel rods driven below the surface. Sam dug out every last one that afternoon with a crowbar and a cursing rhythm that shook the dust off the fence posts. That night he threw them into an old oil drum and set them on fire. Not because it mattered legally, but because it mattered psychologically. The next week brought the subtle escalation they had been bracing for. Anonymous complaints began flowing to county departments. One about potential water contamination from livestock runoff, another about hazardous storage of diesel drums, then one claiming agricultural noise violations during restricted hours. None of them had merit, but they triggered automatic checks and site visit scheduling under administrative code. The brothers were forced to accommodate surprise inspections, one after another. Most of the inspectors, to their credit, were old school and sympathetic, people who had known the Jarretts for years and clearly saw what was happening. But sympathy didn't stop the procedures, and the procedures were where the pressure worked. Each visit cost hours. Each form required time, and time was the one resource the developers never seemed to run out of. Norton started filing counterclaims, methodical, relentless, built on every contradiction and misuse of process he could find. But the opposition shifted tactics again. This time they went after perception. Local news outlets, small, online, mostly read by nearby subdivisions, began publishing lightly rewritten press releases from community development consultants, expressing concerns about land use conflicts and resistance from legacy landholders to community cohesion. The Jarretts were never named directly, but the timing and geographic references made it obvious. The message was clear. People like Sam and Luke were being painted as holdouts, relics, blockers of progress. They weren't just defending their land anymore. They were being cast as villains in a quietly coordinated PR campaign. And then came the second knock at the door. It wasn't Megan Bell this time. It was a man named Randall Pike. Bigger, broader, wearing a cowboy hat like it was costume rather than habit, his belt buckle too polished to be anything but ornamental. He introduced himself as a representative of stakeholder interests and said he wanted to find a path forward that didn't require continued administrative friction. Sam listened silently. Luke stood by the door with arms crossed. Randall unfolded a glossy contract with the words Land Transition Participation Agreement, printed in elegant serif font. The offer was direct: 6 figures to vacate, waive protest, and surrender transition rights within 60 days. The phrasing was designed to sound voluntary, but every line bled coercion. "You boys strike me as smart enough to know when to move on," Randall said, trying to smile. "Sometimes it's just time. What's the point of standing in the way?" Sam closed the folder without even looking at Luke. "We're not moving," he said. "Not now. Not ever." Randall left without shaking hands. That night, someone cut the barbed wire on the north fence line. No theft, no graffiti. Just the fence, sliced cleanly in 2 places as if to say, you can't protect all of it. The brothers repaired it by lantern light. The next morning, Luke found tire tracks near the equipment shed. No damage, but the message was starting to repeat itself. "We're still here, and we can reach you." But the brothers didn't blink. They leaned in. Norton filed for a formal investigation into procedural abuse tied to third-party development liaisons. Sam called the water inspector personally to schedule his own voluntary audit ahead of any further complaints. Luke began reinforcing the perimeter with additional signage, motion lights, and reflective tape. Not to scare anyone off, but to document everything, to ensure that if anything happened next, it would be seen, recorded, and provable. They weren't just reacting now. They were building their own foundation, legal, physical, psychological. Still, the tension grew. The camp that used to rent from them every summer sent word they wouldn't return the following year. Their longtime hay supplier missed a delivery without explanation. Luke's truck was keyed while parked outside the hardware store. Every little thing bled energy. Every gesture felt like part of something bigger. And then, just as quickly as it had intensified, it went quiet. For 3 days, no notices came. No vehicles appeared, no new flags. It was almost worse than the activity, like the calm before a storm that hadn't yet chosen its shape. The land felt heavier underfoot. The nights were too still. On the 4th day, a package arrived. No return label, just a thick envelope and a USB stick inside. On the stick were drone videos, high-resolution footage of the ranch from angles they hadn't even noticed were possible. The files were labeled with dates, coordinates, calculations. The message wasn't explicit, but it didn't have to be. This wasn't an offer. It was surveillance. Sam put the USB in a mason jar and buried it behind the barn. "We're past the line now," he said. "No turning back." Luke didn't disagree. He just went inside and started loading shells into the drawer by the door. Not because he expected violence, but because you didn't keep standing next to a loaded chessboard unless you were ready to finish the game. The first sound that morning wasn't unusual, and maybe that's what made it dangerous. Just a soft, mechanical clunk near the base of the drive, like metal settling into gravel. Too subtle for an engine, too deliberate for an animal. Luke was already up, feeding the dogs when he heard it. He paused for a second, eyes narrowing. He didn't run, didn't call out. He just grabbed the binoculars from the windowsill and stepped out onto the front porch, sweeping the lens across the lower edge of their property. What he saw pulled the last thread of calm from the week's fragile quiet. A crew of 3 men, none of them familiar, all dressed in matching dark gray uniforms with yellow stripes running down their sleeves, were unloading prefabricated steel framing from the back of a black flatbed. There were no visible logos, no company names, no city utility markings, just equipment, methodical movements, and the low rumble of a generator powering up. One of them began using a handheld auger to drill into the ground near the easement. Another began unspooling cable from a thick reel mounted on the back of the truck. Luke didn't wait for Sam. He was already out the door, radio clipped to his hip, calling up to the ridgeline where Norton had camped out in the guest trailer to review paperwork in peace. By the time Sam joined them, the workers had staked out what appeared to be the beginning of a sensor array. 4 metal pillars planted at even intervals, facing in toward the dirt road, aligned with military precision. When confronted, they didn't speak much. The lead man, clean-shaven and tense behind a pair of black glasses, offered only one sentence. "We're operating under Provisional Site Development Authorization." Norton stepped forward before either brother could respond. "That's not a recognized designation in this jurisdiction," he said flatly. "There is no provisional anything here." The man looked at him once, said nothing more, and went back to checking the alignment on one of the posts. That's when Sam stepped forward and put his boot directly on top of the next steel anchor they were about to set. "This is not a discussion," he said. "This is your last warning." The man didn't flinch. He turned toward the flatbed and whistled. A 4th man, previously unseen, emerged from the passenger side with what looked like a printed document in hand. It was a notice of field installation issued under something called the Community Adjustment Doctrine, bearing a stamp that no one in the county had ever seen. Norton took one look and barked a laugh. "You just made a mistake," he said. "You think you're clever because your forms look official. but they're not backed by anything that holds weight on this soil. You're acting under a paper ghost." That was when Luke quietly circled around the side of the installation area, where he saw a second reel of cable, thicker, industrial grade, running into a hastily dug trench that had been partially concealed under a false panel of sod. He followed the cable's arc until it vanished underneath the fence into their land. Not the edge, not the easement. A full 12 feet inside the boundary line, where it snaked into a covered housing near their irrigation control junction. He called out to Sam without looking back. "They're breaching internal systems," he said. "They're on the ranch." Something in Sam's face shifted then. Not rage, not panic, just a sharpening, like someone had finally stopped pretending a storm wasn't coming. Norton stepped back and pulled out his phone. "This is going on record," he said, voice calm but firm. "I'm documenting a live act of unauthorized equipment placement on private land. You've been verbally notified. You are now in direct violation of county statute." The men didn't respond. They had stopped pretending they were here to talk. Luke grabbed a pair of bolt cutters from the fence post and, without a word, walked up to the trench and snapped the exposed cable clean in two. Sparks hissed against the morning air. The generator on the flatbed immediately choked and died. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was electric. Then, without any announcement, a sheriff's deputy pulled up in a marked cruiser. Not one of the regular county boys, but a transfer from a neighboring district. New, young, uncertain. He stepped out cautiously, clearly briefed on something, but already unsure of what he'd walked into. "We've had a report of an altercation," he said, eyes bouncing from Norton to the crew to Sam's boot, still pressing against the steel post. Sam didn't move. Norton stepped in front again. "No altercation," he said. "Unlawful activity by an unrecognized outfit performing unauthorized work on protected land. We're in the process of de-escalation and documentation. This is being recorded." The deputy hesitated. One of the gray-sleeved workers walked up, showed him the forged document, and began speaking quickly, citing codes and numbers that didn't mean anything. The deputy flipped through the pages, nodded slowly, and then turned toward the Jarretts. "This is complicated," he said. "I'm going to need everyone to pause while I call this in." Norton didn't raise his voice, but every syllable struck like a hammer. "Deputy, you have a responsibility to the county charter, not to invented paperwork. These men are conducting infrastructure deployment across a recorded private parcel without court order, survey coordination, or easement negotiation. That makes this a criminal encroachment, not a zoning dispute." The deputy looked down, then stepped aside to make the call. The gray crew began backing up their gear. But it didn't end there. That night, someone torched the side of the storage shed near the west field. Not a full burn, just enough to scorch the siding, melt a few tools, and mark the wall with a crude symbol spray-painted in red. A broken circle intersected by a line. It didn't match any known tag, but it didn't need to. The brothers understood the meaning. It was a warning, an escalation, a signal that they had officially drawn blood, even if only symbolic. Sam stood in front of the blackened wood for a long time, silent. Then he grabbed a can of white paint and covered the entire side of the shed, brushstroke after deliberate brushstroke, until every trace of the mark was gone. Luke didn't speak, but later, when the moon rose high, he sat on the porch with a rifle across his lap and the house lights off. Norton didn't argue. "They're off script now," he said. "They're improvising." The next morning, Norton drove into town to file a full emergency complaint with the county assessor and initiate land use injunction proceedings at the district level. The process was heavy, full of redundancies and prone to stallouts. But it had weight, and weight was now the only currency that mattered. Luke handled cleanup on the western line. Sam began building what he called the second perimeter. Not a fence, but a line of logic. Signs, documented footage, legal declarations, ground stakes embedded with barcodes that linked directly to legal property surveys. They were turning their land into a record, a living file that couldn't be erased or buried. If someone crossed it again, it would be deliberate, undeniable, and irreversible. By nightfall, they had everything in place. Lights triggered by movement. Cameras activated by heat. Copies of all filed paperwork laminated and posted behind locked glass panels at every major junction. Not as a show of force, but as a statement. This is real. This is legal. This is defended. And when the next car came, silent, slow, headlights off, it didn't make it past the first line. It turned around. No confrontation, no posturing, just a quiet retreat. Because now they knew. This wasn't just a patch of land. It was a fortress of will. The days that followed passed with a strange, unsettled calm, as if the land itself was holding its breath. There were no more workers, no more vehicles parked at the edge of visibility, no more drones scanning the ridgelines. The surveillance lights remained untouched, the perimeter undisturbed, but that didn't ease the tension in the Jarrett brothers' shoulders. Instead, the silence felt loaded, like the moment before a hammer drops, or the quiet in a courtroom just before a verdict. Norton stayed on the ranch longer than planned, shuffling paperwork, building the procedural wall layer by layer. They filed 3 formal land status declarations, 4 separate encroachment responses, and a motion for immediate protective jurisdiction. None of it glamorous, none of it fast, but every piece of it mattered. They weren't just defending land anymore, they were establishing record, and record, when done right, had more stopping power than any fence or bullet. One afternoon, a letter came by certified courier. It wasn't from the development group or from anyone affiliated with Megan Bell or Randall Pike. It was from the county commission office itself. A formal acknowledgement of the Jarrett's injunction filing had been recorded, reviewed, and approved for temporary stay. That meant any action taken by third parties, contracted or otherwise, within or adjacent to their property lines now required advance notice, court registration, and review by the county zoning council. In short, the developers couldn't so much as sneeze in their direction without tripping legal alarms. The letter didn't guarantee victory. It didn't promise safety, but it was validation. The county had finally been forced to recognize what was happening and who it was happening to. It was a foothold in a landscape that had been shifting under their boots for months. After that, some things changed. The subtle fear that had crept into their community's edges began to retreat. The old feed supplier started delivering again. No explanations, just back to schedule. The summer camp called to say they'd be returning next season after all, citing reassurances from the county. Even the woman at the post office, who had been dodging eye contact for weeks, smiled as she handed Sam a package and said, "Heard you. Gave 'em hell." Sam didn't answer. He didn't have to. Word had spread the way things do in places like theirs, not through press releases or legal notices, but in glances, murmurs, and changed behaviors. People knew now. They'd seen how close the developers had come and how clearly the Jarretts had said no. But victory didn't taste like celebration. It tasted like ash and dry wind. The burned shed still bore scars beneath the new paint. The irrigation line still ran a little slower near the trench that had nearly gone unnoticed. Luke still checked the cameras every morning before pouring his coffee, and Sam still slept with one boot on the floor beside the bed. The land had been held, but the cost wasn't just in time and effort. It was in the shift that happened deep in their bones, the realization that it hadn't been a one-time defense, but the beginning of a new era where vigilance had to live side by side with daily life. There would be other attempts, other names, other offers dressed up as opportunities. That was how these forces worked, not through a single decisive battle, but through pressure applied in seasons. Norton eventually packed up and returned to his office 2 counties away, leaving behind a file cabinet full of documents and a binder labeled Active Defense, Jarrett Property. Before he left, he said, "They might come back with softer hands. They might even send someone who actually looks like a neighbor next time. But you've got the upper ground now. Don't forget that." Sam nodded, shook his hand, and watched him drive off with the same silence he'd shown up with. That night, the brothers sat on the porch like they always did, the dogs curled at their feet, the stars above wide and sharp. Luke broke the silence first, voice low and dry. "You think they're done?" Sam didn't answer right away. He just took a sip from his cup, watching the wind move through the grass near the road. Then he said, "No, but I think they're quieter now. I think we taught them what it cost to test us." The next morning, the cart came back. The same little patrol cart from the beginning, the one they'd once rolled into a ditch with a note scrawled in thick marker. But this time, it didn't slow down. It didn't stop. It just rolled past on the outer road, driver silent, windows dark, the stenciled letters faded with time. A ghost of the opening shot that had started everything. Sam stood at the edge of the fence, hands in his pockets, and watched it disappear over the ridge. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stood there, the wind catching the brim of his hat, the morning sun outlining the shape of a man who had learned exactly where his line was and exactly what it took to hold it. And behind him, the ranch stood. Not just land and fences and cattle, but something more. A boundary. A refusal. A message carved into the dirt and protected not with violence, but with resolve, with principle, and with the kind of quiet strength that men like the Jarretts never had to shout about. They just lived it, day after day, season after season, because they were county, not clowns.